Max Headroom. It sounds like a commercial airline specification, but that's about as far removed from Max Headroom as you can get, because in reality he was a mesmerising 80s AI played by actor Matt Frewer, who really stood the test of time. Combined with some impressive makeup and visual effects, this uncanny valley pseudo-simulation really felt like something else. It's only natural then that people wanted to mimic this quirky new synthesised character. After all, imitation is the greatest form of flattery. However, on the 22nd of November 1987, when WGN-TV's newscast was interrupted by a strange intruded signal of someone who looked like a Dollar Tree Max Headroom, I'm sure flattery was the furthest feeling anyone had in their minds. This was an unnerving, disturbing and bewildering event that, until this day, no one has an explanation for. But before we get into that, I guess we should cover a bit of Max Headroom history, because as common knowledge as he may be to my core audience, for many young whippersnappers he probably sounds more like a WCW wrestler. God, even WCW is probably a too old reference for a lot of you. It was on the UK's Channel 4 that Max Headroom made his debut during the spring of 1985 in a cyberpunk TV movie called Max Headroom 20 Minutes into the Future, the premise of which was really quite interesting. Edison Carter, played also by Frewer, is a maverick truth-seeking journalist trying to uncover the greed and horror in a Running Man-style future, our near future, including the company that employs him, Network 23, who are trialling Blipvert advertising, which forces 30 seconds of TV advertising into a 3-second package directly into a viewer's mind, sometimes with dire effects. Despite being their top reporter, the network decides to neutralise Carter, and whilst fleeing corporate goons, he crashes straight through a barrier, reading Max Headroom 2.3 metres. These signs used to be over almost every car park and bridge in the UK, until it was changed to Max Height, possibly due to the popularity of Headroom himself. Anyway, with Carter in a coma, Network 23 creates an AI program based on his mind. This glitchy proto-AI wakes, sprouting the first words, Max Headroom, the last thing Carter saw flash into his eyes.
Max Headroom. Max Headroom.
Their plan was, with Max as an AI, they not only keep their audience happy, but believe they can have complete control over what he says and does. But fearing what it knows, the plan is scrapped and the same goons are sought to dispose of both Max and Carter, who subsequently screw it up, with Max ending up in the hands of the punk-controlled competitor Big Time TV, and the real Carter free to live his life again.
Enter data.
Go on, Rich. Enter big time.
However, as good as this short movie is, it had grander ambitions than itself. Really, it was just a launch platform for Max, who several days later appeared as the host of the Max Headroom show, combining music television with a chat show format and befitting Channel 4's mantra to deliver new and edgy content.
What would you do to help the world if you could spend £30,000 a week for the next 1,000 years? Well, that's how much the government are spending on Trident missiles. Don't facts like that just wipe you out? I'd rather tap dance.
By 1986, Max had crossed the Atlantic, airing in the US on Cinemax, quickly becoming a cult personality before landing the role as a global spokesperson for New Coke.
I've got an idea. Why doesn't New Coke have a taste test where New Coke takes on Pepsi, and we'll call it the New Coke Pop Quiz? They have?
Swatch were even sponsored to create a Max Headroom watch. Pretty neat, eh? In fact, Max was everywhere, on magazine covers, in books, on VHS, and even classic computer games, which mostly riffed on the dystopian cyberpunk of that original TV movie. But the fact that New Coke fell flat on its arse is perhaps the most perfect outcome of using Max as your promotional aid. Because Max's core mantra was always to challenge the status quo, whether in the corporate, commercial or cyberpunk sense. I guess Coke missed the memo. Because using him as your corporate shill is pretty hilarious. But as we know, you can get away with all sorts if you do it with charm, especially in America, and Max certainly had that.
So listen to this. Next time, reach for a Coke. Become a Cokeologist. What are you waiting for? Catch the wave. Coke.
Hey there, you funky little fellows! Boy, have I got a treat for you! This episode is brought to you by Munk Pack. Munk Pack. Now, Munk Pack are the perfect snack for anyone who wants to eat better or cut back on sugar and carbs without sacrificing on taste. Plus, there's no high-intensity sweetener or sugar alcohols leaving that bitter aftertaste here. Reminds me of candy bars from my childhood. But without all the rubbish jokes on the wrapper. Munk Pack are gluten-free, contain 1 gram of sugar or less, 2 to 3 grams of net carbs, and each bar is 150 calories or less. Perfect for snacking or breakfast on the go. I strongly urge you to try coconut almond and peanut butter coca chip. They are good. Get 20% off your first purchase of any Munk Pack products by visiting monkpack.com and entering code NERD at checkout, or just simply click the link in the description down below to get 20% off. That's so good. So then, as we arrive on the 22nd of November 1987, at possibly the height of Max's popularity, we have to ask ourselves, just exactly what was this? Before this point, it had been a perfectly normal evening for Channel 9, otherwise known as WGN-TV, an independent TV station operating out of Chicago, Illinois. The 9 o'clock news had progressed up to the sports segment, with Dan Roan providing some synoptical commentary of the Chicago Bears' victory over the Detroit Lions, when at 9:14 PM, the transmission was interrupted. It's claimed that WGN engineers quickly leapt into action and 20 seconds later had switched the frequency of the studio transmission link to a backup frequency, restoring a puzzled Dan Roan to our screens.
Well, if you're wondering what's happened, so am I. Actually, the computer that we have running our news from time to time took off and went wild. So what we're going to do is start over from the top of the Bears.
The computer took off and went wild. Well, that's certainly one way of explaining it to those with single-point IQs. But the reality here is that this was a signal intrusion or hijacking, which I'll refer to from here as a hack, originating from an unknown location and with an unknown purpose. What we see is a figure wearing a vinyl Max Headroom mask produced by Caesar from 1986 onwards. Behind this figure is what appears to be a section of corrugated steel being rotated slowly from left to right, mimicking the effect of Headroom's animated background. But perhaps the most disturbing part is the sound. Presumably there should be audio, but all we get is distortion linked to the on-screen visuals. For whatever reason, this signal hack hasn't been fully successful, and instead of recognisable sound, distortion from the video signal is leaking into the audio carrier wave. Now, if this incident was isolated, it probably wouldn't be as fascinating part of television history as it is. But as the night rolled on, little did the residents of Chicago realise that they would be in for another visit from Max. At 11:19 PM on Channel 11, the PBS-operated WTTW was rerunning Horror of Fang Rock, the 92nd episode of Doctor Who, first broadcast in September '77. In this episode, a shape-shifting alien scout arrives, intending to take over Earth and use it in an intergalactic war. By 11:20 PM, WTTW was airing a perhaps not-so-different type of shapeshifter, and like WGN, it was not intended. The main difference here was that we also had audio, and it actually made sense, at least on the face of it. It may have been distorted, almost alien-like in itself, but by listening carefully you could pick out just what Max was saying. Two minutes later, it was over, and Doctor Who had been restored. WTTW had allowed the whole signal hack to run uninterrupted and into the eyes of thousands of viewers. They had done this because they had no other choice. At 11:20 PM, all the WTTW engineers had left the building, leaving pre-recorded material to simply reel itself out. So when the signal was hijacked, there was no one in the building who could do anything. And perhaps this is exactly why this particular hack was rolled out so late in the evening. But then you might ask, why was the first hack cut short? Why did, whoever Max was, not realise that WGN would be able to cut the signal quickly? The answer I have to that is, perhaps they didn't. Perhaps it actually went more to plan than we were led to believe, and to understand why, we need to understand a bit more about the perpetrators themselves. We don't know how many attempts there have been, but before 1987 there have been numerous documented successes at hijacking or intruding on television signals, and all of these hacks had one thing in common: the people behind it knew what they were doing. On the 26th of November 1977, an ITN news bulletin broadcast by Southern Television in the UK had its audio signal hijacked by a 6-minute speech purporting to be from Vrillian of the Ashtar Galactic Command. The monologue detailed the destiny of the human race and a disaster waiting to happen. Although no one knows specifically who was behind this, it's suspected to be a Southern Television employee. On the 14th of September 1985 in Poland, a television network was hijacked by a group of astronomers from the University of Torun in collaboration with a trade union. Relying on their combined technical and radio astronomy knowledge, they used a ZX Spectrum and some rudimentary transmitting equipment to encode a message over a Polish James Bond knockoff series, and again several days later over the news. The message read, "Solidarity. It is our duty to boycott the election."
June, a great month for the very best from HBO premiere film.
On the 27th of April 1986, HBO's signal from Long Island, New York, was interrupted for 5 minutes by Captain Midnight. The message here was much simpler, a colour bar background with text outraged at HBO's service rates. It turned out that John McDougal, who had a second job as a master satellite control operator, was behind the hack. HBO's prices were having a knock-on effect of his main job, selling satellite dishes. And these are just early hacks, there have been numerous since. But just as satellite jamming required specialist knowledge then, so did overriding an analog broadcast signal. It also required some pretty specialist equipment that the average Joe just wouldn't have access to. Saying that, the basic premise was simple. WGN-TV were broadcasting from their studio to the transmitter located atop of the John Hancock Center. This was via the STL, or Studio to Transmitter link. For that signal to be intruded upon, all the hacker had to do was broadcast a stronger microwave signal on the same frequency towards the same transmitter. This didn't have to be a stronger signal overall, it could have been a weaker signal but broadcast much closer, therefore still managing to overpower the original. The relaying transmitter would then presume the stronger signal was the intended signal and be broadcast across Chicago by the John Hancock relay transmitter. For WTTW, the premise was the same, however the transmitter was located atop the Sears Tower, now called the Willis Tower. It figures then that our perpetrator would have to either be in between these two towers or relocate close to each one for each hack. So, in order for each TV station to restore their signal, either the hijacking broadcast would have to end, or the transmitter would need to be switched to expect a different frequency from the studio. It's reported that WGN-TV were able to do this quickly, as they had access to the transmitter controls, whereas WTTW were thwarted because they had no hands on deck. But let's take a look at that first hack again. You can see the point where the transmitter picks up the new signal as it goes black. You can then hear the point at which the footage kicks in. Now, most people argue that the distortion at the top and the base of the screen make it obvious that the footage is pre-recorded. After all, you get this effect when tape is stretched by the recording and playing mechanisms, and that stretching isn't evident on the normal broadcast, indicating it derives from the intruder's material. However, I found some footage from WGN's U-matic live broadcast recording, which have a much better signal-to-noise ratio, and as you can see, no stretching. This then is more likely to be from signal distortion. What we do get, however, are other VHS-type artifacts, which look like they derive from the intruder's material, and these also stop when the original broadcast returns, although not immediately. When the hijack finishes, there's a couple of seconds where it continues, perfectly consistent with what we'd seen prior. The signal is then brought back under control and the screen goes completely black.
Well, if you're one...
If I up the brightness, the continuity is even clearer. Like this, you can even see a ghost image of Max on the initial dark frames. We then get Dan Rowan moments later.
Well, if you're wondering what's happened...
In the run-up to this video, I've trawled the internet, scanned through archives, newspapers, and even found some incredibly good documentaries on other YouTube channels, but I've yet to hear anyone remark that perhaps the first hack wasn't in fact shut down by WGN-TV, but actually it ran its course. Of course, I'm merely speculating, but another point of contention is that no footage from the first hack appears in the second. Surely, if this was meant to be included as one performance piece, the hacker would have rewound the tape for round 2. But that doesn't happen. Hack number 2 shares zero content with the first. At the very least, it indicates that the person who performed the second hack either didn't care about getting the first part out, didn't consider it important, or perhaps they just forgot to rewind in all that excitement. We don't know. Maybe even the person who broadcast the hack is someone entirely different to who we see on camera.
The hunt is on this afternoon for Chicago's video pirate.
Mission tonight is trying to find out who's responsible for 2 acts of video piracy.
And while it may have been a stunt, it is not treated as a joke. Chicago's video pirate could face a jail sentence and fines for his freelance exercise in public access.
There are 3 main factors that make the content feel so disturbing. The first is the element of the unknown. Because we don't know what the motive is here, we don't know what the messages really mean, we don't even know who's behind it, and because of that, we fear it. The fear of the unknown is the basis for a lot of hatred in the world, and that's why after the event, some people were surprisingly riled up about it.
I got so upset that I wanted to bust the TV set. I really did.
The pirate also overpowered the signal at WGN-TV during Bear football highlights on the evening sportscast.
The second is the disruption it caused. To most people, disruption to the normal flow of TV is just not possible. They can't comprehend that their scheduled programming will be rescheduled, let alone completely thrown off course by someone who seemingly has no connection to the TV station itself. This disruption makes us feel uneasy. After all, if the news can be disrupted, what else in our lives is more fragile than it seems? The third is the mask. For centuries, masks have been used to invoke fear, to create an aura of dread. Someone who wears a mask is instantly lifeless, soulless. It prevents the connection that is normally so natural between humans, and even humans and animals. We can't get a sense of what this character is thinking, we can't get a sense of their feelings, we can't even get a sense of their humanity. Really, I've complicated it. The latter 2 all feed into the first factor of the unknown, but by disseminating each part, you quickly realise that it's the sheer number of unknown elements here that makes the whole spectacle as disturbing as it feels. But it's the mask which prevents us from gleaming any information from the first hack. After all, we can't even lip read whoever this is. There's no identifying information other than what we see. But in the second hack, we can pretty much interpret all of the voice and attempt to work out its meaning, if indeed there is any.
Somebody wants to get attention, what do? They go break into a television broadcast. Just to get attention, like throwing a brick through your window, so to speak. Okay. It's not too bright, really.
The video this time kicks in immediately. There's no darkness, there's no tape roll-in, so maybe it was played too early, before the signal was secured, or maybe we are just rolling from the end of the first intrusion. We begin with what most sources claim to be Now, Chuck Swirsky is a sports commentator and announcer. At the time, he was working for WGN and specifically covered the Chicago Bears. So maybe our hacker was hoping to catch Chuck in action on WGN, although that's unlikely as Chuck's usual job was on WGN radio. However, if we clean up the first part, I don't think he says "that does it." It could easily be "because if," or the end of another sentence, and this could completely throw off the meaning. Most people interpret Max as meaning that Chuck Swirsky is a nerd and a freaking liberal himself, but he could just as well be taking the mickey out of another newsreader, perhaps even the guy presenting that evening, Dan Rowan. Imagine the delivery as something like this. Dan Rowan, he doesn't, he's a freaking nerd. I'm sorry, I think I'm better than Chuck Swirsky, freaking liberal. Max could just as easily be a fan of Swirsky rather than a hater, and his real target may never be known. But for me, the intonation and the higher playful frequency of his voice at this part fits better in this context. We then move on to the whole monologue seems rambling, chaotic, loosely strung together, perhaps trying to imitate Headroom's casual quips, but to lesser effect. By this point, Headroom had been appearing in new Coke adverts for a while. Here, our guy is trolling by throwing a Pepsi can whilst pushing Coke's slogan in a playful, questioning manner. He then flips the bird to the camera. The next line is most likely a reference to local Chicago singer Lou Pride and his song of the same name. He then hums the tune to a kids' TV show called Clutch Cargo, a series from the 50s that had been rerunning in the Chicago area during the 70s. This is a reference to the last episode of Clutch Cargo called Big X. He then complains about his piles before we get treated to a lovely sound of something wet and sloppy hitting the floor.
Oh, I just made a giant masterpiece for all the greatest world newspaper nerds.
Before alluding to the fact that the defecation he's just made aligns with what WGN consider to be the news. Greatest World Newspaper Nerds is a misrepresentation of what WGN stands for, World's Greatest News.
My brother wrote the other one.
We then move on to the glove. Now, this could be taken literally, but November 1987 was also slap bang in the middle of Michael Jackson's Bad Tour, which heavily featured MJ wearing a single glove on the opposing hand of Max. Tellingly, this tour was also sponsored by Pepsi, perhaps alluding to Pepsi being a dirty brand, or perhaps MJ himself, or maybe it's just a reference to the new Coke and Pepsi rivalry. Again, this is something that hasn't been posited elsewhere, and all I can do is speculate. We then get a very clear jump cut, further confirming that this is definitely pre-recorded material. Another figure, most likely a woman, appears from the right, wearing what appears to be a German barmaid costume. Max then holds up his mask, which seems to have what news segments described as a marital aid sticking out of its mouth, whilst saying, "Where do we go? They're coming to get me," perhaps in reference to this very broadcast and how naughty they have been. A slightly higher pitched voice running through the same distortion filter, who we presume is the new character, then says, whilst beginning to spank Max. Max responds with exclamation before the woman perhaps playfully touches his butt. You can then see the point at which the recording stops and the signal is dropped, allowing Doctor Who to continue, to the utter dismay of some viewers.
No, I just thought it would be just a slight mess up, but that in the middle of the tape, it's going to be... We're going to have to tape over it.
Okay. Alright, places.
Well, the first is that there were likely 2 people involved in the filming, at least. Presuming the camera was on a tripod, then the barmaid would have been responsible for rotating the metal sheet during the first section. Then, when she appears on screen, we can see the metal sheet is static. It's possible that these are the only 2 people who know exactly what happened that evening. The audio for the whole incident seems to be run through some sort of effects box, perhaps something as simple as a microphone hooked up to a guitar effects pedal. This is why everything seems distorted, and it's certainly easier than adding all this in post-recording. It's also a more complex setup than just relying on the camcorder's built-in microphone. Again, this duo knew what they were doing. The effects used are actually pretty good. That rotating metal sheet has been thought about. Not only did they know what they were doing, but they also spent a lot of time preparing and planning. We also have evidence for Max's disdain for WGN, or at least certain newsreaders at WGN. It's no accident that the first intrusion was on that channel, and perhaps this re-establishes the argument that the whole performance was intended to run solely on WGN during the popular 9 o'clock news. Although given the short time frame, they were clearly prepared for the second intrusion regardless. Knowing just how to intrude on both signals was definitely predetermined. This could quite easily posit Max as a disgruntled former employee of WGN, someone with the technical know-how and motive to pull off something like this. We can also extrapolate that Max is very likely to be politically conservative. It's hard to tell just how conservative, but his liberal quip certainly doesn't seem to be a positive remark. You could posit that the German barmaid dress and ties of the real Max Headroom to Aryan imagery could be a reference to Nazi Germany and place him very politically right, but this is pure speculation. There's just no evidence for it. The rest seems to be ramblings based in local or pop culture. References to Lou Pride and Clutch Cargo perhaps suggest that Max resided or had ties to the Chicago area for at least a decade. But again, it's just speculation. Anyone who tries to sell you this as hard evidence is either trying to sensationalize or would just make a piss poor detective. Your Love Is Fading is also an opening lyric for the Temptations song I Know I'm Losing You, that's been covered by a multitude of other groups, so could just as easily be a reference to that. And Clutch Cargo, well, that was aired across the entire nation. This, at best, is just circumstantial evidence. What's clear is, even with the WGN references, there doesn't seem to be an overriding narrative or message. It feels very much like this was perhaps even a joke. A thing was done because it could be done, perhaps to gain notoriety among the local hacking scene, perhaps as a very private joke among friends. We can also presume that the signal was broadcast from somewhere between John Hancock Tower and the Sears Tower, which is actually not a huge patch of Chicago, but big enough for it to be almost impossible to triangulate the signal. Still, you could perhaps whittle the location down to a few of the high-rise blocks which existed in 1987. However, the lack of evidence didn't stop the internet from getting in on the case some 20 years since the event took place. In 2013, Vice, through a Freedom of Information request, got hold of the FBI report of the Headroom incident. The report was written by the Assistant Bureau Chief in the FCC's Field Operations Bureau, Dr. Michael Marcus. Marcus, an expert in TV hacking and radio transmissions, had joined the FCC in 1979 and immediately began developing policies for advanced radio technologies. He would go on to help catch Thomas Haney, who hacked the Playboy TV channel with religious text in September '87. Marcus states, "I think the bad guy got close to the receiving end and just transmitted a signal that was received with a stronger strength than the more distant intended signal. He posits that the intrusion very likely took place from a high-rise apartment near to the towers or even a rooftop. The studio transmitter link frequency would be easy enough to get hold of, and then with proximity on their side, the intruding microwave signal just needed to be strong enough to be picked up by the tower transmitters, taking preference from the studio transmitter link." Marcus states, "It did need a dish antenna, but if they got close to the STL receiver antenna at the TV transmitter, then a direct TV size antenna might have been adequate." He postulates that the gear required to pull this off might have cost around $10,000, but could have been sourced from the amateur radio market. It could also have been reasonably mobile. The FBI went to great lengths pulling and printing stills from the broadcast quality U-matic cassette copy that was recorded from the intrusion in a bid to identify the culprits or at least pin down the filming location. But perhaps the most intriguing evidence was that spinning backdrop. Marcus goes on to say that the background looked to be about 8 feet wide industrial type metal, maybe a roll-down warehouse door. That would have limited it to certain places in the city where the video could have been filmed, and one tip sounded particularly promising, one that pointed at a particular person, someone who worked for a company that had a warehouse-like space in the city, a place that might have played host to the video shoot. Unfortunately, the investigators had no probable cause and therefore no warrant. This was just a hunch that led to a dead end. It had to be someone who knew the technology, maybe a broadcast techie, but there were other techies who could figure it out also. The case went cold. In 2012, a Reddit user by the name of bpogue created a thread entitled "I believe I know who was behind the Max Headroom incident that occurred on Chicago TV in 1987. The poster goes on to state that in their early teens, a number of their friends were into the local phreaking and hacking scene. Although much older than the poster, they kept company. 2 of these friends were brothers who they called J and K. J had what he describes as moderate to severe autism and was being cared for by his brother, K. They go on to describe J as having a disturbing yet amusing sense of humour, sort of sexually deviant in nature. They also describe him as being erratic in conversation, both traits you see in the Max intrusion. Plus, importantly, they mention that J spoke in a very similar manner to the person seen in the video. The poster goes on to say that at a party in K's apartment, a discussion was overheard where Jay was planning to do something big over the weekend, and when pressed, K just said to watch channel 11 later tonight. The poster knew that Jay was already into radio hacking and the electronics behind it. Jay had mentioned a police radio he recently acquired and had hacked to cover practically everything. Jay was also particularly into newspapers and apparently hung around convenience stores early in the morning to get the paper first thing. The poster goes on to say they realised sometime later it was likely J and K who were behind the prank, with the woman being K's girlfriend. Now, this sounds casually fairly convincing, and there's a degree of further evidence and edits to back it up, but by October 2015, a seemingly final edit was posted stating J and K have been officially eliminated as suspects. The linked post, however, doesn't completely absolve the duo. It describes conversations that the poster and Rick Klein have had. Now, Rick Klein being the curator of the Museum of Classic Chicago Television and actually the operator of Fuzzy Memories TV, who uploaded the hack video copy. They, having spoken to technicians actively working for WBBM, WTTW and WGN, concluded that it would be too difficult for an outsider to pull off the intrusions themselves, therefore absolving J and K from responsibility in their eyes. Rick's theory is that Max had strong ties to the local Chicago broadcast community and perhaps therefore was a disgruntled former or even perhaps current employee of WGN at the time. But maybe, just maybe, J and K were in fact behind this. Maybe they knew people in the broadcast community and maybe, just maybe, they pulled off the greatest TV hack of all time.
So what did you think about the whole thing?
Very, very funny.
What we read on the internet can never be known for sure. Motives can be covered up, stories can be changed at will. All we know for sure is that this November, 35 years will have passed, and given the statute of limitations has expired for the crime, you'd expect that if someone was going to come forward, they would have done so by now already. This may well be a mystery that is never definitively solved, and personally I think that's a good thing, and I suspect exactly what its architects wanted. Here's an event that years later people are still talking about, and it was the perfect hack to do that. The context, the period, the location, the props, and the confused content are a powerful potion. A potion that will likely stand the test of time and have many people talking about it for many years to come. The fact that Max Headroom as a character was really making a mockery of the very thing he purported to be is also perfect for this incident. By taking on the Max Headroom persona, the hijacker manages to be both creepy yet hilarious, hitting the pop culture nail on the head whilst maintaining that disparaging attitude towards their own parody. All of these factors really make this the greatest television hack of all time. Before I go, 3 things. First, please check out the independent film Intrusion that's based on this whole escapade. I used a few clips from it throughout and it's really good viewing. Second, make sure to check out the other references I've linked below because there's content on this which really deserves more coverage, especially the Bizarre's criminally underviewed documentary on it. Thirdly, if you fancy watching something similar, please check out my last video on the internet sensation Bert is Evil, because YouTube completely screwed that video over by slapping age restrictions over the first upload, and I had to re-upload it, so, you know, I'd be grateful if you could give it a few more views. And that's it. That's the Max Headroom incident. I hope you enjoyed this piece of history that I've found fascinating for so many years. Until next time, I've been a budget Max Headroom hacker. Toodaloo. Oh god, it's so warm in here. I don't know how that guy did it. That's it. That's the shizzle. Right there. That's the money shot. Oh yeah. God, my glasses are steaming up and everything. How did that guy? He couldn't have seen anything. No wonder he wasn't reading off a script. No wonder he made it all up. You wouldn't be able to see anything in front of you. Good God.
For centuries, masks have been used to invoke fear, to create an aura of dread.